Okay, Speed City fans, I am delighted and privileged to welcome to Speed City for the first time Tim Mayer, who is one of the FIA's 4 permanent chairman of the Stewards. And I would argue, Tim, probably one of the most senior Americans, kind of behind the scenes a little bit. Not everybody may be aware. We've bumped into each other at airport after airport and rallycross and Formula One and so on and so forth. I'm sure Bob the same. But welcome to Speed City. Thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you. Actually, Bob and I have known each other for nearly 25 years now, because we both were involved in Champ Car and IndyCar and that kind of thing. So, yeah, right. we've known each other for a while, and you and I, Jonathan, for about 10 years through the racetrack there in Austin.
That's right. Well, look, let's start off by saying, like I said, people are probably well aware of the other Americans involved in Formula One, but perhaps not at what you do. So why don't we get an overview, first and foremost, of your role within the FIA and part of that 4 permanent chairman of the Stewards?
Well, I have a number of roles within the FIA. I'm involved in endurance racing and rallycross, as you mentioned, and I'm involved in a lot of the rules making for things like safety and circuits and things like that. But within Formula One, I'm one of the 4 permanent chairmen of the stewards. And so we're basically just stewards. We're just the 4 senior stewards amongst the group. We rotate from race to race. In the stewards room, we will have a chairman, a driver steward, somebody like Emanuele Pirro or Derek Warwick or somebody really experienced, really senior like that. We'll have an international steward. So they come from all different countries. And we've got about 15 of those that rotate through the year. And then we also have the local steward who's national to wherever we were. So last weekend it was somebody from England, and then this weekend it's somebody from Hungary. And so we coordinate the 4 of us and our decisions. And we write up those decisions and take the plaque afterwards.
Well, how does one become a steward? Obviously, the stewards have been front and center the last couple of race weekends in Austria and Silverstone. Where do they come from? How are they vetted? You say they're very experienced, and certainly in the case of the drivers you named and the many others that have served as driver stewards, they are very experienced. But what exactly are you looking for in a steward?
Well, stewards come from a variety of different walks of life or areas of motorsport. Some, like for instance Steve Pence, who is probably our newest American steward, came up really from the ranks of the flaggers and the marshals on the side of the track, and eventually he became a senior marshal, and then eventually became kind of a coordinating official for SCCA, and then he became a steward for SCCA, and then he went through the FIA's training program that we do annually in Geneva. He did very well, scored very highly on the exams, and then was brought to 4 races as an observer, got to participate in some of the decisions, but his name wasn't on the piece of paper. And he was very highly rated. And then he was brought on as a Formula 2, Formula 3 steward. So now he's doing it at that slightly lower level, although I think most of us would argue that Formula 2 and Formula 3 is harder than Formula 1 in some ways, because they've got a lot more going on. And so it's a great training ground. But I mean, for instance, Bob, my first job in racing was as a bag boy for Emerson Fittipaldi. I ran around in the paddock helping him out, and then ended up in broadcasting, of all things, organizing international television. And then I ended up helping build a racetrack, and then I ended up helping put together safety teams, and then I ended up in Champ Car as the director of operations there. And I ended up ultimately at IMSA running sports car racing. I was the chief operating officer of IMSA. And then I had the opportunity to step away from sort of actively managing. And anybody who's run a sanctioning body knows that it's a lot like Groundhog Day. You keep beating your head against the wall. It's a very thankless task. And those like John Doonan, for instance, who's currently president of IMSA, who do it are incredible people. And ultimately, the FIA picked me up and said, okay, well, if you want to come to a couple races, this was before we had a formal training process. They said, if you want to come to a couple races, you come along, pay your own way, and we'll see how you do. And I did. And, they said, okay, well, why don't you come to a couple more? And eventually they said, oh, well, maybe we'll pay for your flight. And ultimately I came along, and I was doing at the time GP3. I did a bunch of GT racing for the FIA. I did, all kinds of things in Europe and around the world. I've done the F3 race in Macau and all those kinds of things. And then ultimately worked my way up so that I was picked as an F1 steward, as an international steward. And then what are we? A decade later, I'm chairman of the stewards.
Your resume, and I won't take time to run through it. People can Google it if they're interesting, but you really make me question my life choices over the last 30 years. What have I been doing? You include education in England and in the United States and Army Ranger service and on and on and on. It's pretty impressive.
Bob, if I was even remotely clever, I wouldn't be in motor racing. None of us in motor racing are making a lot of money doing it. Well, there are a few exceptions to that.
Tell me about it.
Christian and Christian Horner and company leap to mind. But I mean, we all do it because we're passionate about it, and we're passionate about the people. People gasp when I say this, but I'm not really a racing fan. I'm absolutely a fan of the people who are involved in racing, and just working with them at that level at Formula One is just remarkable.
I'm going to say, having worked with Emo, it must be pretty fun watching little Enzo and Pietro flying about now. Have you come across them?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. They've never been in my steward's room,
Good.
But I have come across them, and it is fun to see, children and grandchildren doing this, and I get to see Emerson from time to time, and that's great fun as well.
Tim, it's the process. We want to know how the stewards interact with, say, the jurisdiction of the race director or the scrutineers, or even, right down to the pit lane marshals and the corner marshals and so on. Where do the stewards fit in?
Yeah.
Well, there's sort of a pyramid, and in theory, the stewards are at the top of that pyramid, although I like to think of it more as we're at the bottom of the pyramid and we're sort of the pointy end is at the bottom. But because really without the marshals and corner workers and that large group of people that come out and stand out in the cold and the wet and the hot and the sunny and all those kinds of things, that we couldn't do it. But at a typical Grand Prix, there's probably between 300 and 500 marshals around the racetrack, between safety and flagger and communication and that kind of thing. So, and then there's the technical people. So there's two groups of technical people, the ones that the FIA bring, and then there's the local scrutineers. So you'll see people in the garages, usually with a vest on saying scrutineer. And those are local marshals that are trained. In the case of the US, most of them are actually engineers that work out of Detroit. I mean, they work for Ford and GM, and they're very senior engineers, and they really know the pointy end of a car from the blunt end. They're not just kind of looking and going, wow, isn't this great? And then, we've got a lot of safety people and all that kind of thing. But as you said, our primary interaction is probably through the race director, Michael Massey. Michael succeeded Charlie Whiting in somewhat tragic circumstances. And Michael has had a very busy 18 months. He took over about 6 months before COVID kicked off. So he's had not only to contend with starting a new job in probably the toughest position in motor racing, but he also has had to help organize all of the races under COVID conditions, which, believe me, is a real trick to getting that circus to move around the world. And Michael and the people at Formula One management have done a remarkable job to do that. So we interact primarily with Michael, but also with Joe Bauer in the technical department. and they report to us if they find something that they think is off. And it can literally be as simple a report as, hey, this doesn't look good. Could you look at it for me and see what you think? In the middle of the race, that's a pretty common call. I mean, we have an intercom system between his room and ours, and he'll just say, hey, look at this. And between us, we're all networked together. So we've got some people that help us from a great company called Riddell, and they use a software system that's put together by a company called SPG, which the teams also use. And it basically allows us to review all of the information that he might need us to look at. Now, the casual viewer gets to see one angle or two angles from the TV broadcast. If you buy the F1 TV package, you might online, you might get a couple of other angles of it. We typically on a race weekend have about 120 to 150 angles of video that we can look at, along with audio, telemetry, GPS data. I mean, there's just all kinds of stuff, and that SPG software helps us manage all that information and brings it into us. And then we'll look at it, whatever the incident may be, whether it's an on-track incident between two cars, or whether there's a more technical issue in the data or so on. And we're connected in as well to a whole group of data engineers. So they might send us a graph of some sort or some technical data, and we'll take a look at it and decide whether it breaches the regulations. And, we have, the Formula One regulations are probably 200 pages, if you include the technical regulations. 150 of that will be the technical regulations themselves. And within the sporting regulation, there's only about 10 that really cover racing. The rest of it is all, how do you line up for the start? How do you do this? How do you do that? But I mean, the rest of it is pretty much, procedural rather than sporting. The sporting is quite thin. And then obviously our listeners can't see this, but I'm waving a pretty thick book of additional regulations that we have. Those are all different appendices and different rules and bits and pieces that might become relevant as we go along. So it requires quite a bit of study. It's not simple, but generally the racing incidents are simple. They just come down to who did what to whom. And there are some rules that cover that, but the racing regulations really, as I said, are less than 10 pages.
And Tim, just to dig a little further, let's just take a theoretical incident involving, like you say, involving a couple of cars. So we all see it on TV. We all see it at the same time. We're all live. But just take us through what happens next. Does one of the teams, or how does the whole process kick off? And if you like, give us the triggers that end up with you getting involved.
Well, the probably 90% of the incidents that we look at never make it to TV. There's the broadcast can only look at a couple of cars at a time or a few cars at a time, and there are 20 cars on track. So often what will happen is we'll see something on a monitor somewhere. The race director will see something on a monitor somewhere, or the teams will get, their driver will say, hey, that guy just hit me, or that guy just did this, that, or the other thing. And they'll call in to Michael. The teams can't call to the stewards directly, but they can call to Michael. They'll say, hey, can you look at this? It happened at this time, at this lap. And he'll look at it. If it looks like something, and again, it doesn't have to be, he doesn't have to decide it's a problem. It's worth a penalty. He just has to decide that it's what we call an incident that needs to be looked at, and then he'll shoot it up to us. We, again, because we're networked, we can electronically see what he's seeing, and we'll look at it. We'll look for other angles if we need to, and then we'll make a decision. And probably a lot of them we have a process where we say, okay, no further investigation necessary. Sometimes you'll see that on the screen, and sometimes you won't. Mm-hmm. Something that you've seen on television, whatever we decide, usually you'll see our decision. But for that, all that other stuff that happens to the back markers or happens, it's not part of really the story of the Grand Prix. We'll put it up on the messaging screen, and the teams will see it. But the general public won't necessarily see it. Or we'll just say noted, which is our polite way of saying thanks for calling. Right. Quite often what was happening was the teams sort of felt that the stewards were sort of the three blind monkeys, don't see, don't hear, don't know. And so we instituted this procedure where if we saw something, we noted it. And quite often, we would see something that the teams didn't see, and their driver didn't tell them. I mean, hey, I did this to that person, or this happened, or whatever. So it was a tool really between us and the teams. And if it becomes something that we need to really look at, that we say, yeah, this is a problem or potentially a problem, then we'll put it up as under investigation, and we'll go through sort of some steps to decide what the penalty should be, if there should be a penalty, or whether we just say no further action in case it's a racing incident.
Tim, you know as well as I do that our friends in NASCAR have a certain approach to the way they run races, and their view basically is send the fans home at the end of the day knowing what they knew about who finished first, who finished second, whatever. If there are penalties involved, they'll come later, but don't change the results of the race after the fact. Yet, as you pointed out, at times in Grand Prix, we'll see word from the stewards going up that an incident's going to be investigated after the race. How much urgency is there in the stewards room to get a decision out now for that reason or some other one? Why some incidents are decided during the race, others postponed until afterward?
Well, the ones that are postponed fall basically into two categories. There are the ones where we just genuinely don't know what happened, and we need to talk to the drivers. I mean, something happened. It definitely affected the race. It was a problem, but we with all the data and with all the best will in the world, we can't figure out why it happened. And so we'll talk to the drivers, and that's one category. The other category is when two drivers crash out, and they're both out of the race. Then there's really no urgency to doing something during the race. But I mean, if we can do it during the race, we're going to do it during the race. There are some very technical issues that can arise during a race where, whether it's, to do with engine data or something like that, where we need to give the teams the opportunity to respond before we just make a decision. A lot of times we can see, or our technical guys can see issues in the data that are very explainable. And so we need to run that through rather than just say, okay, it's a penalty because of this. Our relationship with the teams, the FIA in general, and I would say the stewards in particular, is very professional. I mean, we're on very good terms. They have incredibly experienced, very professional team managers. Jonathan Wheatley at Red Bull has been doing this essentially all his life. Mm-hmm. Ron at Mercedes has been doing this. I knew him a little bit. He worked for Honda at one point in IndyCar for a very brief period of time, but he's been doing racing all his life, and very, very professional, very knowledgeable people. And so, our discussions with them are very low key. They don't want a penalty, but they know what we can see. So they don't usually come in and try and tell us a story that doesn't really happen. Sometimes there's a matter of interpretation, and clearly those matters of interpretation are the ones you hear about. Those are the ones that are most controversial, and it happens. But it's such a very collegial atmosphere. And I don't know whether those guys walk away and say, look, those stewards are idiots when they walk away, but for the most part, it doesn't seem like that.
Tim, Bob brings up a good point about NASCAR, and I also look towards NFL as well. And obviously, we're concerned with the American audience, and one of the frustrations we get from the viewers, and I understand it, and I'm sure you do too as an American, which is just that, which is they can't understand why arbitrations, stroke, the most recent incident we've had, gets dragged along. And they want a decision. Have you, motor racing is a moving target. Have you and the stewards discussed, different ways of trying to make it more complete or at least understandable to a sort of instant gratification audience, especially someone like the States?
Well, listen, I'm on a couple of boards with the guys at NASCAR. I've been involved in American racing my entire professional career. So I'm very familiar with the US style of doing things and having a very strong, powerful, I would say, race director, or in their case, sometimes they call, chief steward or whatever they call, the person depending what series it is. And they make a decision, and that's the decision. That's all there is. Teams can be equally frustrated with that. I think NASCAR and its teams all understand that they are primarily an entertainment. And so, my hats are off to them for the way they do it. I mean, I love watching American football, and I call it American football just because my English friends would get very upset if I called it just football. Yeah. But I love watching it. I could sort of care less about the football itself. I just like watching the referees. I think what they do is just nothing short of remarkable.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's my phone kicking off here. I mean, to be able to call the plays they call more or less instantly, mm-hmm. I mean, it makes my eyes water. It's fantastic. I mean, even in American racing, we have the benefit of replays up in the booth, and we'll look at them a couple of times and then, make a decision. And the guys, like a Bo Barfield at IMSA, the guys at NASCAR, the guys at IndyCar, they go way out on a limb and make those decisions. And, they affect the racing, obviously. It's just not the way European / FIA racing has developed. They want to know that the answer is a very considered answer. Yeah. When I first started stewarding for the FIA, we literally had a VCR and a pair of binoculars. Those were the two tools we had. We saw the same thing that the audience saw, and quite often we got it wrong. I mean, we really did. Now I would argue that, we get it wrong very rarely. We do. I mean, of course we do, but very rarely. Now, after that, there can be an argument about whether it should be a 10-second penalty or a 5-second penalty or a whatever. I mean, again, in the old days, it was a drive-through penalty or nothing. I mean, those were your two choices. Okay, maybe you could do a drive-through, stop and go, something like that. But those were your choices. Now we've got sort of more fine choices. And, the argument that we get in the stewards room often is, well, that should be a 5-second penalty, or it should be that should be a 10-second penalty, or whatever. We're now arguing about, which side of the pin do we dance on most of the time. I mean, and every now and again you get something where people will decide, no, it should be no further action. That was a racing incident, or no, that should be a bigger penalty, whatever. But most often you discover that there are different groups that will argue on both sides of that. So, I would tell you that I think that if you've got that situation, you've probably got it about right, somewhere about right. When people are arguing on both sides of that argument. So, it's very, very rare that you hear now in Formula One, Formula Two, Formula Three, just the stewards messed it up. I mean, you just rarely hear that. And that's nothing to do with us as individuals. It's just our system now is very thorough. We spend a lot of time training. I mean, that's something that people wouldn't even consider, that we do an annual training. We do quarterly trainings. We do every race, there's a review after it to review all of the incidents, to talk about them very openly. We talk about, I'm actually looking at a steward's dossier from one of the races where we say, we think we came to the right decision, but maybe for the wrong reasons, and we're very self-critical. We are professional in that way. So, yeah, I mean, but at the end of the day, to answer your question about why doesn't it happen much quicker, it's really often because the teams want us to be that thorough. The stakes are so high in terms of money, in terms of points, that they'd rather have the right answer slowly than the wrong answer quickly, or have that as being a possibility.
Are your decisions in the room, are they always unanimous? Is it majority rules? Are the parliamentary procedure rules in order here? I mean, how do you, what finally happens before the ruling goes down the pipe?
So if you read the regulations, it's a majority decision. But practically speaking, we never, I won't say never, but rarely, very, very rarely. And I mean, like, it's happened to me once in 3 years, the last 3 years that I can think of. We rarely let a decision out of the room until it's unanimous. And if we can't come to a unanimous decision, then, the benefit of the doubt goes to the competitor. We're not going to penalize somebody if there's any doubt in the room.
Gotcha. Tim, you mentioned and when Emanuele Pirro and Derek Warwick, the drivers' stewards or representative. Can you explain their role? Is it to represent the drivers, or is it to give you an insight from a driver's perspective within the room?
It's to bring a driver's perspective to the room. I started doing this before we had driver stewards, and all of us were experienced enough that we could pretty much come to an answer without having a driver's point of view in there. The drivers, though, will come to a decision about a driving incident much quicker than we will. I mean, they get it just like that. I mean, they don't usually need a replay, and some of them are really remarkable that you'll be watching something and they'll say, "Whoop, play that back. That was a problem." And it's like, we're like, what? And lo and behold, yeah, it absolutely was. I can give you an example of that. The Verstappen overtake off the track at Coda on the left, turn 16 or something like that. I think 18, 16. A few years back, that was caught by the driver steward that day. And I mean, literally, he just instantly said, "Whoa, we've got to reverse that." Yes, lo and behold, you go back and replay it, and yeah, he was a meter off the track. I mean, he went well off the track in order to make that pass. So, but it happened so instantaneously that nobody really caught it. I mean, including, by the way, the team that was being passed. I mean, they didn't catch it either. So, it happens. There are now speed bumps in that location at Circuit of the Americas, so that really can't happen that way anymore. But it's a great tool. And then the other thing is that when we have a conversation with a driver, or drivers, they can really parse out what those guys are saying. I mean, drivers speak in code. Often it's English is their third, fourth, fifth language. And although all of those guys are very articulate, a lot of times it's hand movements and, okay, and then this, and I was easy flat through here, and and you kind of go, okay, hold on, slow down a little bit so I can get the translation in my mind. Whereas the driver steward understands it implicitly. I mean, they've been on that corner, they know what's happening, they know what it feels like, because so much of racing is transmitted through the seat of the pants. It's funny because we get these descriptions of an incident from a driver, and they can tell you a 3-second incident and it takes them 5 minutes to tell you, because they're post-processing so much detail. But that's not really what went through their head at the time. I mean, it's instinct. These guys have done this. They've served their 10,000 hours in a car. So for them, it's all feel and instinct. And for us to know what they should be thinking about versus what should happen instinctually, the driver steward helps us out tremendously with that. And, besides that, they're very good technically. I mean, they can all look at data and stuff like that and help us interpret that. So yeah, they've got a big role in the room.
Do you find do you have a big Rolodex of drivers who want to do that job? And when we guys like Emanuele Pirro turns up a lot, but we've also seen Derek Warwick and Tom Christensen and Mika Salo and my old kart television colleague, Danny Sullivan. I mean, are the drivers lined up for this role, or are there those who say, hey, I want no part of that whole
No, and honestly, there's a long list of guys that have done it once.
Thanks, goodbye.
Yeah, I bet Eddie Irvine's not on that list.
No, it's I mean, first of all, it takes. I mean, you really have to be willing to put up with quite a bit of criticism, and Emanuele in particular has come in for a lot of criticism, in my opinion, very unfairly, for making, he just happened to be the driver steward in the room at the time. I can tell you he made decisions that every other driver steward would make. He doesn't make them on his own. There are 4 guys in the room who sign, and we have a couple women, by the way, who are on the team. So, I mean, it's, it's not them. Emanuele has come in for a lot of criticism, but he's an absolutely brilliant steward.
Yeah,
I mean, understands the racing, can explain it, which is really important for the rest of us, and is passionate about doing the job right. I mean, he cares so deeply about doing the right thing, in terms of somebody with deep principles. I mean, I think that's true of all of the drivers that we have, whether it's a Tom Christensen, who's just a remarkable person to sit next to for any period of time. Derek Warwick, who I've become very, very good friends with, any of those guys. But we've got some new ones, Antonio Luizzi is doing the racing, and he's turned out to be a very good driver steward because he does a lot of driver coaching, and so he's learned to be critical and to go through the process and go through the steps. But yeah, there's the list of drivers that don't want the job is much longer than the ones that do.
Tim, I've got one more for you, and thank you for your time. But given that you've got also a TV background as well as your steward's background, I just wonder, as you sort of look into the crystal ball, and the technology seems to improve and improve on every week, is there something that you would like to see developed for your job and your fellow steward's job that would help, identify some things? And the example I would use is, well, not example, but I noticed in the European Championships that soccer, that is, that now the TV companies are using their own analysis referee to look at a call while they're looking at VAR, which I thought was interesting, and wondered if that it would be hell in a bucket for you guys, or whether you could actually see a company like Sky or whatever getting their own sort of steward figure to discuss things that are controversial outside of the obvious. But let me go to your crystal ball first.
Well, my first question is it a paid job? Because mine isn't, and that would be a kind of a nice paid job to have.
There you go.
Um, yeah, I mean, one thing for people to know is that all of the stewards are volunteers. I mean, we do it out of pure love of the sport. Most of us, well, not most of us, all of us have been very successful one way or another in our racing backgrounds, and so this is our opportunity to give back. But I mean, I have to tell you, I actually watch the Sky broadcast as we all do on now on ESPN, and you know, I like watching Karun or you know, any of those guys at the Sky Pad doing the replays and kind of giving their own analysis. I actually enjoy watching that because they do a very, very good job of analyzing those incidents, and it's very similar to the sort of process that we go through. I mean, they do it much, you know, in a much more abbreviated manner, but you know, I would perfectly welcome that as a kind of a more universal thing. You know, I don't think any of us shy away from the idea that a certain amount of controversy is good for the sport. You know, and if people want to think that we're wrong, you know, there's going to be a certain percentage of the time that they're going to be right. I mean, so, I mean, we are very self-critical as a group. You know, welcome input. We get a lot of input from the teams. And I think that's probably something that people don't really understand, is that the rules in Formula One are co-written by the Formula One teams. You know, I have somewhere around here, a set of penalty guidelines, which is a whole list of different infractions. Here it is. And so, I mean, here's all of the different infractions that we can have. There's 6 pages. I mean, it's not all of them, but you know, the majority of them. It's 6 pages, and it's a list of suggested penalties, you know, for least severe to most severe. So, and all of that's been signed off on by the teams. I mean, so it's a very cooperative process, and including the criticism. I mean, you know, you hear the public criticism, but then there's a lot of private feedback to us one way or another. You know, team managers come to the stewards pretty regularly and say, hey, how did you come to that decision? And then when they hear, they'd say, okay, well, you know, next time, why don't you consider this? And it's, you know, that's great. I'm not a great fan of them, you know, a lot of feedback during the race or during decision making. But mind you, I came from racing in America, where we used to have team managers come up and throw chairs across the room. So, you know, I mean, it's all good to me. So I'm, you know, as long as they spell my name right.
Well, thanks to Michael Massey, you won't be dealing with team members in the in the stewards room, at least until the race is over. One more question from me, Tim, and it's a personal one. You grew up in a racing family. Father is Teddy Mayer, your uncle, the late Tim Mayer, for whom you were named. You have 2 sons growing into their late teens, I believe.
Yeah.
Knowing what they know about Dad and Grandpa and the whole family tradition, are they interested in getting caught up into this gypsy circus of motor racing?
My older son does. He is looking forward to being appointed a Formula One steward anytime in the next 12 months. Forgets that I have had a 30-year career leading up to this.
Right.
My other son, he came to the 24 Hours of Le Mans. He's young. He's younger. He's 17, was 15 at the time. Came to the 24 Hours of Le Mans, discovered they had really good internet, and decided that he was going to play the 24 Hours of World of Warcraft. And that was his interest. So no, he's not terribly interested in it. My older son is. He actually has done some work for some local teams here. We live in Atlanta, and just outside of Atlanta, near Road Atlanta. And he's done some work for some teams there, and some guys have given him some opportunities, and it's great. He's actually officiated a couple of races there at Austin. He was a pit marshal for an SCCA race there, so he's into that. He would much rather be a driver, and I've told him he can race absolutely anything he can pay for.
There you go.
Great answer. Well,
Tim, I
Tim,
want to thank you so much. We appreciate your time to explain all these things to us.
yeah, Tim Mayer and Bob Varsha, thank you so much for giving up your time. I think it's a fantastic duty, a fantastic job that you do on behalf of Formula One and the FIA. Keep up the good work. Thank you for giving us this insight, because I do think Americans really wanted to know a little bit more about the procedure. That's a fantastic insight. And keep going and keep traveling the world. I don't know how you do it. But thanks for your time today, Tim Mayer.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege.